did I say? Yeah. Usually nothing else. You may be familiar with this object. That's it. Now, if it stays up, there now. I blew it up, but that isn't the main theme tonight. It was already. It wasn't designed. Remind me of a famous poem by Morgenstern, which I will not recite at this time. No. All right, then. This was my idea. You see, this was the idea. I've been working with various subjects. It wasn't just one subject, but various subjects for quite a while now. But this is where they all come together. They all come together and focus on this strange object here. And before we come to grips with that subject, though, with this subject at all, there must some things that must be taken care of, and that's what I'm going to do in this talk. That's why I'm not going to have any pictures. So most of you can go home. And so it's the pictures you came for. The experiences are, you'll see what we have to get out of the way. We have an obstacle here, and it must be moved before we can budge an inch. Experience has taught us, the amateur in Egyptology, that he can count on being shot down before he ever gets off the ground by the professionals, of course. Those bearing the credentials with which official guardians of the crypt to enrich themselves or entitle themselves. Well, we'll say entrench themselves, a better word, isn't it? In the past, this insolence of office, Shakespeare, we may get some quotes here. We don't have to take them down. They've already been written by other people. He gets credit for that one. Have been vigorously exploited as an insurmountable obstacle to any serious discussion of the Book of Abraham. We've seen that happen. I had a series of articles in the era running from 1967 to 1970 dealing largely with that subject. So bear with me while I try to cast some light on the problem, which can no longer be bypassed if we to reach any meaningful conclusions. Anything a Latter-day Saint, for example, might say about Abraham and the Egyptians is subject to immediate liberum veto, a catch-22 situation. I had it sent to me once this week. I've got it already. A minister in the South, a passage I love to quote from the Smithsonian. Missionaries years ago used to say the Smithsonian supports the Book of Mormon. Well, they'd sooner be caught dead than that. But they give the stock answer, is that no reputable scholar will accept anything that Joseph Smith says on Book of Mormon subjects of the line. And catch-22 is that if anyone accepts it, she automatically ceases to be a reputable scholar. That happens all the time. You see, there's some very eminent scholars, as soon as they accept it, well, in that field at least, can't accept it. So, see what we wrote after that, yes. The present topic, which is the meaning and the significance of facsimile 2 in the Book of Abraham, this argument will not hold up under examination. That's what I'm going to talk about now. But who is to challenge it? I mean, when they talk about the competence and no creditable scholar, this, that, and the other. Well, we must challenge it, of course, but we are impugned before we do proceed. Another quotation from Shakespeare. See, I'm trying to tell my students they have to read more Shakespeare, and it helps, especially, but as we cannot impugn you as you do proceed. Remember, that's what Portia says, Merchant of Venice. We'll lose by default, and we must devote much of this talk to those who have dealt critically, however lightly, with facsimile 2 in the past. So that's what we're going to talk about. So now, one gains a little enlightenment or facsimile just by staring at that strange object there. I've seen people stare at it by the hours, and it gets them nowhere. Its oddity has been rather attractive. Its ornamental value on candy boxes and calendars and era covers, magazine covers and things like that is very much appreciated, a neat design like that. And but nobody's ever got very much out of it, actually. Indeed, it's made so little sense that various editors have taken liberties with it and have taken no particular pains to copy it correctly. This, in the new editions, is printed again. See, this is by Reuben Hedlock. That's the one that in 1842, Times and Seasons, and who incidentally Reuben Hedlock was a missionary companion of my mother's great uncle, Ed Sloan, and they were in Ireland. They were both Irish, and they were being chased by a mob in Dublin. And the mob was throwing rocks on them. They suddenly stopped and said, "Wait a minute here, we can throw better than they have. We both herded sheep. This is awful throwing." And they supplied them with all sorts of ammunition. So Reuben Hedlog and Brother Sloan started to pick that up with devastating effect. They sent half the mob, not half, but a number of people to the hospital, and they routed the mob. They were much better at throwing doilies than the Irish themselves were, being Irish. Well, but that has nothing to do with the subject. Well, he was a good engraver and a man of considerable integrity. But you'll notice here, for example, here he's carrying a staff. Well, in nearly all the other editions, they just didn't bother to continue this down. They didn't know what that was doing there, so they cut it off. It was just left off. Of course, this means he's carrying something that looks like a turkey upside down. And I actually had an assistant church librarian take me aside in great confidence and explain to me that is not a turkey, it's a dove upside down, and it's the Holy Ghost, you see. They took it seriously, see. But they didn't care whether the thing was reproduced properly or not. This is the way we treated everything like this, kicked them around. Now we get back as nearly to the original as we can, and that's a policy we should always follow. Always get as near the source as you can. Not something that's been prettied up. Well, so far, the speculative interpretations by various people, including me, have fallen flat. Through the years, no electrifying discoveries have been made about it. No one has committed himself by any positive declarations regarding an official explanation of the figures on the disc. That's as it should be. The actual owner of this regarded as a very deep secret, his own personal prized possession. He was an important person. He drew it himself. He kept everything to himself with the greatest secrecy, and you're not supposed to know what it says without proper hints. Now, the awkward name hypocephalus used for that, it sounds like somebody's gallant steed from Greek epic or something like that. It was handed to us by Champollion when he found an Egyptian Greek text referring to it as something under the head, hippocephali. And hippocephalus was called that way. They called it that, ended in the nominative. The Egyptian term for it is bescherchep, which means a fire, a flame, a spark, or heat under or supporting the head. That tells both what it is and what it's supposed to do. A typical definition of thing, this is Wiedemann's, this is the way we find in dictionaries and so forth. He calls it as good as any. A stucco disc of papyrus, linen, or bronze. The interesting thing, it wasn't in the Joseph Smith case. It's a entirely different story we're going to have to tell here, but let me not get ahead of that story. A stucco disc of papyrus, linen, or bronze, which by the figures and formulae inscribed on it had mystic power to preserve the needful warmth of life to Osiris, which was placed under the head of the mummy. The brief paragraph on the subject in the... Need to speak louder. Is this thing working? Hey, wait a minute. Start over again. Replay. They'll have to have a replay on that. Well, they do that at ball games. Why don't they do it here? Instant replay. Only, can you hear it? No? Yes? Well, lucky people. Thank heaven you've missed nothing and leave now. Because if it's not going to work better than this, but all right, tell me to shout. I can shout. This is not Coca-Cola in this. This is nature's drop. If it was, I'd be more lively and inspired. Well, no, here we go. So then, all right, we'll go much louder, obnoxiously loud. The brief paragraph on the subject of hypocephalus, which is called Kopftapel, the Germans, we don't have a name for it actually, in Helck's Lexicon of Egyptology, which is the latest, finds nothing noteworthy to say about the hypocephalus, well, there's something else, save that they were round and put under a mummy's head to produce the flame of Re for rebirth in the beyond, the jenseitige Wiedergeburt. Typically, Ehrman has to add his own explanation of the thing as a definitive statement. He's always so positive about these things. Under the head of the mummy, one placed a round disc of linen, which was painted with a peculiar Zeltsamen, remarkable, strange figures. It gives the dead warmth beneath the head so that he would not get cold in his sleep. To this day, it is the head, which is that part of the body which the Egyptian most carefully wraps up at night. This practical common sense explanation, which is Ehrman would accept no other, fails to mention mosquitoes, the fact that your head doesn't get particularly cold in Egypt at night. It does in the desert sometimes. But it completely ignores the ample statements of the Egyptians themselves on the subject and why they put it there. Most hypocephaly are not made of linen at all, but of stuff that can't be wrapped. And if wrapping the head is a natural and universal practice in the land, why do we find it only in one family, in one short period of time, and in one place? It's not a universal custom at all. You just find it one. There are not many of these, very few of them, actually, relatively speaking. Why do we find head-warming devices used only a brief period, special people in limited areas? The one thing that most commentators feel worthy of noting is the fact that it's connected with the Mormons. They nearly always drop that in, and that's in these other definitions we saw here. For example, the Wiedemann, after his definition, he adds to it, a certain part in the religious life of our own times has been played by a similar hypocephalus, that is, the Mormon scriptures. And the lexicon adds, the hypocephalus, curiously enough, is also included in 3 sacred books of the Mormons. Budge says the same thing. Strangely enough, I think it quite strange that Joseph Smith should have it. It was strange. How did a thing get from the Upper Nile, from Thebes, to Kirtland, Ohio, 1835. That's another story. We're not going into it all. You don't touch that at all. Budge says the same thing. Strangely enough, almost the earliest publication of a hypocephalus is that given in a work by Joseph Smith, Jr., the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, entitled A Pearl of Great Price, 1851. Remarks made there about it have no archaeological value. Elsewhere in 1904, Budge refers to the remarks as idiotic. Is this the time to tell about? I'll tell about Budge a little later. Wilford told me a very good story about Budge, so I'll tell you that one. Théodule de Viriat, one of the earliest, he devoted a special study to the subject to show how widely Joseph Smith's interpretation differed from those of science. Well, in those days they didn't. And Samuel Birch said only that the inscription is so badly engraved that it's not possible to make out its meaning, and Smith's interpretations throw no light on it. That was way back in 1855. And the first serious study of hypocephalus was 1852 when the Florentine was unwrapped in Florence. So this is the first one. This is usually noted. Our hypocephalus has always attracted special attention, like everything else Joseph Smith produced. As Budge notes, was not only possibly the first discovered and the first published, but until the present decade, actually just last few years, it was the only one in the Western Hemisphere. Since then, one has been acquired by Boston and the other Pennsylvania. Birch's remark that the inscription cannot be read is revealing, because a young Latter-day Saint scholar read it without much trouble in 1988. He didn't knock himself out of it. In fact, it was rather easy because there are plenty of other guides to follow. And that's Brother Rhodes. We'll mention him later. It was Samuel Birch who was leading influence in promoting the study of the objects. Samuel Birch, he was the professor at Oxford. He got all excited about it and suggested to European scholars that they compare all the hypocephali they could find to see if they had some secret message in them, to see if they could interpret them some way. So he undertook an extensive program in the 1880s where they all pooled their knowledge. They only had about 21 of them were available in all the world at that time. They compared them to see what was in them and so forth. They were examined and compared by scholars in Britain and on the continent. With magisterial insight, Budge declared Joseph Smith's hypocephalus to be from the late Dr. Birch's papers. He knows it all, doesn't he? Because Dr. Birch was 22 years old when Joseph Smith got these papyri anyway. And of course, he hadn't begun to study Egyptian at that time, and to have left his papers behind at that age so that Joseph Smith could get hold of them after they'd been imported. There's a little chronological. But this is the way Budge, things don't bother him like that. Budge, well, he has the longest title, the longest biography in all of Who's Who. He claims to have written on every subject, everything you can imagine, to have known everything. It was absolutely magisterial. You couldn't refute him on anything. And Wilford tells me the story about when he was invited to visit Queen Victoria at Balmoral. And he was an enormous man. I don't know how big he was, but he weighed between 300 and 400 pounds. And Queen Victoria had heard that he would need a special bed. She wasn't thinking in terms of the size of the bed, but what would you make it special? Well, mattresses. They put on 3 or 4 mattresses for Dr. Budge to have sweet slumber. And of course, when he went in, he sunk clear out of sight. He called for help. The footman couldn't rescue him, so they had to call in 4 footmen to fetch him out to rescue Professor Budge from his bed. Was that one of Edwards's? Yes, Professor I.E.S. Edwards, the authority on pyramids, told that. He's full of those merry stories. He knew all the old boys. And so the late Dr. Birch was 22 years old when Joseph Smith is supposed to have plundered his papers, though he'd never gone into Egyptian at that time. The most thorough treatment of these doctrines way back was by J.P. de Horak, who discovered in the Hypocephalus nothing less, he says, than le fond et la substance de la doctrine égyptienne, the foundation and the substance of the whole doctrine of Egypt, which would make it very important if that was so. That makes it a singularly valuable object. Why then was a study completely neglected after that? After the middle of the 1880s, it was completely dropped, never touched again for 65 years. From 1883 to 1847, nobody even mentioned it. And during that time, the number of hypocephali increased from 21 to almost 100. And interest in the hypocephali evaporated from 1833 to 43. The thing ceased to be, we're told, an object of serious study. Between 1900 and 1965, only 6 new examples were published. Well, there was a flurry of interest in 1943 and 44, occasioned by an argument between Louis Pellers and Louis Capart. But it was only a passing thing. It was only the Joseph Smith issue that kept it alive. So that when the church in 1967 it didn't acquire this, but acquired other Joseph Smith papyri. We've noted Budge's aspersions in 1904. It was in 1912, we're getting ahead of the gun. If we go to 67, wait, to 1912 was the big enterprise. We have to mention that. It was in 1912 that the Reverend Spalding of Salt Lake mounted a full-scale attack, which he predicted, quote, would signal the end of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's going to do it. To do that, see, he gathered together, he wrote letters to all the leading Egyptologists in the world. He got answers from some. He got a jury of 8, which was pretty good. And for this, he was able to gather the statements from 8 Egyptologists of varied competence. He calls it an anthology of the judgment of the world's greatest Egyptologists. Brother Chodal summed up their findings by observing that there was practical unanimity in their conclusions that Joseph Smith was wrong. But he goes on and says, but none of them offers an interpretation of the inscriptions. Nobody offered to translate a word of it. This is all the more remarkable, says Brother Chodal, because they all agreed that the object is very familiar to Egyptian scholars. So they said, we just couldn't forget it that way. Well, to spearhead the attack, Spalding had enlisted the skill of a young minister, S.A.B. Mercer, who explained that no attempt was made. He took charge of the letters and so forth. In the conclusion, he says, no attempt was made to translate the text because, he says, the hieroglyphs, with the exception of some simple signs, were incorrectly copied. The usual complicated signs were always wrongly copied. Well, by comparing it with others, we don't have time to do that now. We'll have use for others later on. But you see, that's not so at all. It was not difficult for Brother Rhodes to pick up from not just the hints of the others. This is a standard one. It follows the same pattern as many others. So they should not make a great difference. Well, they couldn't do it at all. It stopped them cold. He says, he further explained, I like this. He says, the reply of each scholar was brief, very little time being devoted to a study of the prophet's work in general, since it required only a glance to find out that linguistically the subject was not worth much of their valuable time. Hence the brief replies. You get the point. We just can't bother with it at all. Of course, the work was done, he says, as sincerely and scientifically as possible. Sincere and scientific, with only a glance. He said it took only a glance. They knew what the answer was, so all they just sent was a brief note to him, and that did him all right. Well, in spite of the Reverend Mercer's efforts, which he was convinced would destroy the church, or perhaps because of them, since such programs have regularly been counterproductive, we owe him a debt of gratitude. For after his retirement to Paris, I think it was 55 or 57, when our brother Tyler, our librarian, went over there to close the deal with him, he retired in his old age and wanted to sell his library, and he insisted that the Latter-day Saints have it. Now, in his old age, he put it up for sale. His fine Egyptian library, which he'd collected over many years at McGill University in Canada. For some reason, he let the BYU have it at a price less than 1/3 of what was offered by any other university. Well, now, is this repentance or something? What's the idea? And that included Harvard, which offered, I say, more than 3 times as much as we were offered. Brother Tyler told me. Well, God moves in mysterious ways, because without Mercer's diligent campaign against the prophet in 1912, we would be put to much considerable trouble at the BYU to refute him. But thanks to his collection, it's rather easy to refute him. Isn't that nice? He arranged all that. It must have been deliberate, or somebody twisted his arm. But and then, of course, in 1967, as I mentioned, the issue was revived when the church acquired some of Joseph Smith's papyri. Again, the experts were summoned. Again, every of them ignored the proper clues to the hypocephalus, namely the inscriptions on it. I think it would be instructive and entertaining to read the verdict of various authorities, though, well, here's some of them. Well, beginning with Birch in Oxford. See, who was the one that led the thing. And he says in 1883, this inscription is so badly engraved that it's impossible to make out its meaning. Well, what kind of scholars were these people? And then the great Budge, I tell you about Budge going to bed in Balmoral. He says facsimile 2 was taken from the papers of the late Dr. Birch, which I say was a very young man who hadn't started to study Egyptian, yet Joseph Smith was able to get into his papers. So, and then A.E. Sayce, who was a great linguist, but he was just into everything. He says in 1912, just an ordinary hypocephalus. There were about 25 of them known at that time, just ordinary, you see. And George Barton says this is merely an attempt to imitate Egyptian characters. It's untranslatable as they stand, as they do not faithfully represent any known writing. Now, that was a great Egyptologist. He looks at this, that doesn't represent any known writing. He sees nothing Egyptian in it at all. There's something wrong here. They're biased, you see. And then our friend S.A.B. Mercer himself, by comparing it with, I like this one, with any elementary book of Egyptian language and religion, this meaning of facsimile 2 becomes unquestionably apparent. All right, just run out and get a handbook of Egyptian grammar. Immediately it will become completely apparent what this means, according to Brother Mercer. And Lithgow, who was in the Metropolitan Museum, he's in charge of that section of the Metropolitan at that time, said, "Why, that's a sad joke. The representation is the most common of all Egyptian papyri, practically among the rarest, you see. It's the view of the sun god in his boat, the chief god of a polytheistic people." The Times reported what he said. He says, "The things that puzzled the inspired Mormon translator are no puzzle at all to Dr. Lithgow. They were simply snatches of the hymn to the sun god inserted on every flat disc that was put under the head of the ordinary mummy." But didn't these people know anything at all about it? No, they didn't. Then E.J. Banks, who was imported to the U of U to give a special study on it, really to put everything right and settle the things once for all. You see how in he is here. He says, it has been estimated that something like 20 million mummies have been discovered. Beneath each mummy's head lay a cushion. The discs, found in great numbers, all nearly alike, varying only slightly with the period from which they come. 20 million of them. At that time, 1912, they had less than 50 of them. Oh, much less than 50 of them. So here we are, these people. 20 million mummies. Every one of them had one of these under his head. This is the world we live in, ladies and gents. Eric Young, now he's speaking in 1968 here, you see. Eric Young, a very good friend of mine. The text is too badly copied to attempt a translation, but it consists of short invocations addressed to various gods to obtain protection for the dead man. How does he know that? Well, it's a safe guess. That's all he's doing, of course, but it's not a safe guess, as it turns out. And then Professor Hughes at Chicago, in 1969, and this really surprises me when they were getting letters about this 67 business. He says the hieroglyphic, and he puts hieroglyphic in quotation marks, the hieroglyphic inscriptions are just faked marks, such as a modern cartoonist or illustrator makes when he wants to give the impression of a hieroglyphic text. Needless to say, they cannot be read by anyone, even though he be skilled in the ancient Egyptian writing and language. What a pompous statement, you see. There's just a cartoonist would fake it. He didn't recognize a single symbol there. Was he blind or drunk or crazy or what? Well, I knew him. We had a nice time one night at a party at Bears. He told me how he got into Egyptology. You won't follow that up. But It's reflected in this remark here, just the same. And then John Wilson of the University of Chicago in 1968 said, an unrelated collection of magical spells and religious hymns intended to promote the welfare of the deceased Egyptian. Now, long ago, Budge noted, and he was right when he said the texts and vignettes found on hypocephalae are to all extents and purposes the same, though they're fuller than others. And when you find the same figures in the same position and roughly the same design, well, how could you call them unrelated then? They're obviously following a pattern, a very well set pattern. So for my teacher, John Wilson, to say that they were unrelated charms, just put on there anything but that. You'll find at least 50 which have almost, it's almost identical with the Vienna, 2 from Vienna almost exactly like ours. And so they can't be accidental or just thrown together or anything like that, just to supply a charm or a talisman. That's safe to say because it was the common custom just to throw junk together. You know, this is a great thing when you're dealing with magical charms. But this isn't a magical charm. That's the point. We'll see that when we get to it. And so we may say that a definite pattern is undeniable. Let's consider that next, citing the opinions of some highly recommended scholars who've commented on the hypocephali in general, the others as well as this one, you see. We'll call them the giants, because these have been called the giants of Egyptology, and now we get to our subject here. This is Adolf Ehrman and his contemporaries. Adolf Ehrman is hailed, as quote here, as the scientific leader not only of German Egyptology, but of that of all other lands. He deserves our special attention. Here's something I just noted. It's written by in 1985, just recently. Eric Horning wrote about this. Very interesting thing. He said, he discusses the area of study to which the hypocephalus belongs, namely the funeral literature of the late period. He notes that it is only recent, bringing to light fresh new ideas about the Egyptian view of life. What kept it up so far? Why has it been kept back so long? Why have we only discovered? By recently means the last 10 years, you see. And he says only recently have we got the fresh new ideas about Egyptian view of life. Until now, this most important area of study has been almost completely neglected thanks to the influence of one man, Adolf Ehrman. So that's why we're going to talk about him. We're quoting him again, whose great authority was sufficient to kill serious study and what he considered mere fratzen, just fratzen, trifles, fooling around, doodles. That's what he considered it. And Ehrman was able to put a stop to the whole thing because of his great authority in life. And he goes on and says, it has taken the greatest effort to revive that study, and meantime, the documents inscribed mostly on the walls and of the royal tombs have been steadily deteriorating under exposure to tourists and the elements, and the documents have practically disappeared on which the interpretation rests here, thanks to this one man, Ehrman. So I'm going to talk to Adolf Ehrman. He succeeded Lepsius, the grand old man of the Berlin Academy, from whom he tells us in his autobiography he learned nothing. Now this is how the Egyptians rate themselves. He learned nothing, both because of his own indifference and Lepsius' limited knowledge. He says, Lepsius couldn't teach me anything. He was a lousy teacher. He always spoke very formally. He would always spoke from the podium, would never speak to a student after class because he was too... This was the Berlin scholarship. This was what it was. It went along with the Prussian Junkers and the rise of it. They were building up Prussia, and this was the Berlin. He would never speak to a student out of class. He was utterly formal at all times. He says I wasn't able to learn a thing from him because he didn't know anything, for one thing, and he wouldn't teach me if he did. He says that. He's quite frank about it. 4 eminent Egyptologists aspired to become successor to Lepsius at the head of the Berlin school, and that included Ehrman, who got the job. The first in line was Heinrich Brugsch, to whom we're very much beholden. In spite of his great accomplishment, he's dismissed by Ehrman as frivolous, unscrupulous, undisciplined, leichtsinnig, and poorly educated. He says he was too enthusiastic. You shouldn't be enthusiastic about your subject. That's bad taste, you see. I always like to cite the case of Blas's work on, Friedrich Blas's work on rhetoric, on Greek rhetoric. He starts his book by saying, I have never been able to get interested in this subject. Then he writes 2 volumes on it. This is German professorship. So he says, He was too enthusiastic, too broad in his talents and interests, too generous and impulsive to be a serious scholar, freely giving away information to whoever asked for it. You can't do a thing like that. Not at the BYU. You have to sign up for it and be registered, or you can't come into the class. That's the way we are here, too. You know. We're following the Berlin pattern. Next was Edward, in line for the office, was Edward Naville of Geneva. He was a Swiss, whom Ehrman finds unpardonably imaginative, not really scientific at all, and worst of all, guilty, or quoting him, of going over to the English and French with a childish hatred against l'École de Berlin, the hatred of his school of Berlin. This is an interesting thing, too. One of Mercer's jury that he got, one of the 8 that wrote, was Edward Meyer, the great Edward Meyer. And he was by far the most honest and thorough student of Joseph Smith of anybody. Nobody in the church has studied Joseph Smith the way he has. And but again, he represents the school of Berlin here. Well, Professor Jaeger told me, who was at Berlin, he was the head classicist at Berlin until the Nazis kicked him out because he had a Jewish wife. But he told me some very interesting things. One of them was that Edward Meyer's talks were very dull, very dull. The only time anyone ever came to them was when he talked about the Mormons. And then he said, then you couldn't get in. The place was packed. That was it. But the point is here, the School de Berlin and the French jealousy, the jealousy among scholars. When America declared war against Germany in 1917, he was seen running down the Unter den Linden with his hair flying, screaming in a loud voice and wildly tearing his Harvard diploma. That's the kind of democracy. They took this nationalism, this German pride very much to heart, and it was part of the academic picture, of course. Well, the third was Johannes Dümmichen, a great collector of inscriptions. Again, quoting Ehrman, he says he was an amazing fanatic, almost pathological. He lacked the intelligence to attempt reading the inscriptions he collected so diligently, and his friends called him Dümmlichen because he was unable to compose a proper sentence. Some friends, Dümmlichen, the great Dümmlichen. Well, then George Ebers. Ebers was the real founder of the Berlin School. He says he doesn't know anything about Egyptian grammar. That's the trouble with him. Jean Capart, the authority on Egyptian art, was completely taken in by obvious forgeries. This is another thing, an aside. The forgeries. The last time I saw Professor Baer when he was here, he said, you wouldn't know the museum in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. They're very proud of their collection of Egyptian, Old Kingdom especially, artifacts. And he says, they're all being phased out. They're fakes. After 30, 40 years, his Breast had got them. You see, Breast had brought them there, probably almost 50 years ago, and they're all being phased out because they're fakes. He says they're being very embarrassed about it, but they're getting rid of them. A better story than that is that I.E.S. Edwards told us about Sir Robert Monde, fabulously rich man who grub-staked a lot of archaeologists, and one time at a banquet after a successful dig, they were celebrating, and Sir Robert Monde, they had found a valuable ring, a good ring, and he had duplicates made of it, and presented them to some of the dignitaries as etiquette, you might say. And so they were passing around the rings and the original at the banquet, and they hadn't passed them around long before they lost track of the original. They were never able to find it. There were such good copies, and faking is a great thing in Egypt. Of course, it's a fine art. It's something you always have to deal with. I don't know. Of course, I wasn't with Brother Griggs when he discovered the beautiful mummy. I wonder if he put that together. That would take some skill, wouldn't it? Well, anyway, he talks about Petrie. Petrie was uncritical and didn't know the language. Now I'm going to tell you another story about Petrie. He was the grand old man of Egyptology. He's the father of archaeology, Egyptian archaeology. And he was a surveyor only, and he went to Egypt to take a measurement of the pyramid, and he got interested and he stayed there. But I was celebrating my own 80th birthday recently. I remember celebrating George Steindorf's 80th birthday. George Steindorf was the grand old man of Coptic studies, and he was quite a one, George Steindorf. We went out. I went with James Breasted's son, James Jr., and we drove out to North Hollywood to celebrate Steindorf's birthday. And he told us an interesting story about Petrie. When he was a young man, he went to Egypt to visit Petrie. They went up the Nile. It was a long journey, a hot day. Petrie was excavating near the shore, and he came down to meet him. Well, it could have been, I think it was I think it could have been as far in as one of the pyramids there. Well, anyway, it doesn't make any difference. But Petrie was down to welcome them, and he had a dinner spread for them. He welcomed them on the shore. It was a hot day, and they had a tent spread there, and places, picnic tables under the tent, and everything ready for them. They went to sit down. And the main dish was a huge bowl of rice, a mountain of rice, and it was just covered with flies, black with bluebottle flies, he said. And everybody waited and waited, and nobody wanted to take it. And Peter says, "What's wrong? Do you mind the flies?" So he reached under the table, he said, and got out a large box of Keating's insect powder. Remember the name, Keating's, and he sprinkled it lavishly all over the rice. He says, "I find out it kills them, doesn't kill me." That's the kind of a man Petrie was. Very bluff, very, very bluff indeed. You have to be that kind, I suppose, to survive in archaeology. That's why Wilford's the kind of person he is. He bowls you over. Well, so hey, let's get on here. And Fritz Hommel, I used to be a Fritz Hommel fan, though he made a significant contribution, was a romantic full of fantasy, would never do, he says. Though Ehrman's friend Alfred from Saillet was both competent and learned, he enjoyed the subject too much to treat it only as a delightful game. He was a Sunday scholar, he said. He never learned serious, hard, drudging, miserable work. That's the kind of work you have to do. If you enjoy what you're doing, you can't be a good scholar, they say. Berlin, you're a Sunday scholar then. Well, how did these men ever get their reputations then? Well, this is explained in our next. I'm going to have to speed up here. Just getting off the ground. Ehrman and Lepsius, he said, used to laugh together over the pretensions of Gustave Maspero, who's, you know, the great French archaeologist, who showed, quote, how easily one can become celebrated in this field, since the public absolutely knows absolutely nothing about it. In saying that, of course, what's his name himself nearly gave it away. If the public knows nothing about it, Gaston could get away with it. It was Gaston, right? Could get away with it, and that's also why Ehrman could get away with it. That's a special aspect of Egyptology of which Ehrman is keenly aware. He says nobody else knows anything about it, so he can get away with murder. And that's the thing we have to watch out for. He says no one is so offhanded, so clumsy in judging antiquities as the men of science and the technical specialists. He had small patience with the archaeologists, their paltry learning, said, their wunderlichen Fantasien, always fantasizing. He was especially disturbed by the way departments and individuals in the field could certify themselves, claiming eminence simply by virtue of having been the first to excavate something with or without permission. It's because of the romantic nature of the subject and the total ignorance of the public that Egyptologists are able to get away with it. He admits that he himself could not ride on this wave of public enthusiasm if it wasn't for that very thing. It was romantic and fashionable and glamorized, and that was the foundation of his great reputation. He says his fame would be very small without it. And then, well, on himself, well, since his tremendous reputation made him free to talk quite frankly about himself, and he didn't mince matters there. If he was blunt in his remarks about others, Ehrman's reputation was so great that he could afford to be equally frank about himself. Elementary and high schools were a complete waste with him, he said. He was, as he described it, a delinquent student, the butt of his classmates, an utterly listless, empty-headed, completely unmotivated student who would never do his homework and all his life had nightmares about the hell of his school days. Well, there's an interesting scholar. We think everybody has to get grades today and you have to go to school. Well, more to the point, he sincerely regrets that he never learned to read Latin or Greek at sight, and that his history, he was a total loss. Now here, the great philologist could never read Latin or Greek, but that's the training required for everyone in a German Realschule. And history was a total loss. In geography, he said he could locate 3 kingdoms in Germany, but the rest of the map was blank, terra incognita, he said. I guess he could locate Bavaria, Baden, and Prussia, or Saxony. No, that'd be 4. He couldn't locate that many. What then was the secret of his success? It lies in his definition of success. He was determined to make a science of Egyptology, and this is the thing that comes up. Quote, I wanted to understand the papyri and the inscriptions, really understand them and not be obliged to guess so much of the time. To this day I have not changed my position. But he ends up with the common observation of all conscientious Egyptologists. Quote, only too often we have a good idea what a sentence means, but its more exact translation is still in our present knowledge of the language not yet possible. The temptation is simply to give up translation altogether. But if we wait until all these doubts are resolved, we'll be waiting a long time, and with some texts forever. So he never achieved the scientific certainty he was after. He says, not a single hour passed in which I did not preach the ars nescendi, I don't understand it. And only God knows what the Egyptians were thinking of here, were my daily confessions. Ehrman's secret, he says, was honest, slow, productive work, and the return to healthy, sound reason. Only by unceasing reworking of the text, by comparing, combining, surmising, and often by daring guesses, was it possible to make any progress. Daring guesses, that's the very thing he said others must never engage in, is guessing. The very thing to avoid. One word after another and one form after another had to be subdued. We are still obliged to come to grips with linguistic problem in every text that is not completely obvious. And he was trying to read Egyptian, as they'll tell you today, in a way it can never be learned. Piece by piece that way. Ehrman ends up with a refrain familiar to all Egyptologists, quote, only too often have we a good idea what a sentence means, but its more exact translation is still in our present knowledge of the language not yet possible. The temptation is simply to give up translation altogether. Well, he says, we'll be waiting forever otherwise. De Horak, the most diligent student of hypocephaly, notes that though a text may present no serious difficulties to a translator, it's another matter when it comes to what the thing means, you see. Especially theological and mythological content of the text. Perhaps we have missed the meaning, writes Neville, because we insist, now this is the very thing that, he's taking a dig at Ehrman in here, obviously, I think. Perhaps we've missed the meaning because we insist on dissecting the expression and translating each of the separate elements literally, which is exactly what Ehrman said he was doing, and could not reach the answer that way, because language isn't constructed that way. As Anthus points out that a translation, this is a recent statement, of a typical formula consists entirely of very familiar words, as usually translated means absolutely nothing. So what do we have here? And we must never overlook the possibility, as Siegfried Schott reminds us, that religious texts may be translated in more ways than one. They're meant to be translated, all correct. The difficulty does not reside in the literal translation of the text, this is De Buck talking here, but rather in the sense which is hidden behind the words with which we are familiar. Under normal conditions, Henri Frankfurt observes, the thing may have no significance, but in certain situations and contexts, the same thing may have great significance. That would imply to something like this. You'll understand that. In certain situations and contexts, the same thing may have great significance. In another situation or context, the same thing might have an entirely different significance. So it's pure irony that the standard work on Egyptian religion for many years was that written by Ehrman. I talked about the way Blas started out his work on Greek rhetoric. This is just as bad. This is how he begins his great work on Egyptian religion. This is how his opening words, apologizing to the reader. Quote, one cannot ask anyone to have any enthusiasm for this barbarism, this age-old accumulation of absurdities. So he goes to give us this big book on the subject. Well, if he's not that interested in it, what does he expect you to be, and so forth? He tells us he had little sympathy for the Egyptian religion as he did for the Bible, and his own belief was something, quoting here, which the Egyptians would view with contempt. From childhood, he says, the church was entirely without influence on me, and the school almost the same. Religion is the bad boy, the Schmerzkind of Egyptology, he writes at the end of his life. For half a century I have wrestled with it, and how little has come out of that one can be sure of. Everyone still invents his own Egyptian religion, and one can say that their own invention is all false. The task is simply insoluble. I have never been able to escape the verdict. And why did he write 500 pages on the subject? This always interests me. Well, that's German scholarship, being conscientious, does a nice, neat piece of work. Doesn't know what he's doing. I can give you lots of examples of that. I have never been able to escape this verdict. After a century of research, he says, the study is in a bad way. Each scholar has his own version of Egyptian religion. Despite vast amounts of material, the difficulties appear simply too great. Nothing belongs to a definite time or a different category. It's all jumbled together. And that's quoting Ehrman. How then could Ehrman treat the subject with any confidence? He had the key to the whole thing. It was evolution, of course. He just tell him how to do everything he wanted. It's typical. Egyptian religion, he says, now this is the typical formula of the day, went through the same evolution as every other major religion. How did you know that? You see, in which everything moves from naive belief and simple worship of early times to the rational humanism of later times. You begin with a simple, relaxed agricultural religion, its cultic activities calm and rational, he says, as purely secular, profane, freely invented stories gradually was raised to the status of a religious record. This is some theory, you see. Naturally, the gods were promoted from village gods to city gods, from city gods to national gods, and finally to imperial status. You look for that. It was because the priests had to spoil everything with their theology. Temples, schools, and libraries, he says, all of them is an abomination to him. He says, uns ein Gräuel. This is just the thing that spoiled Greek religion were the writings on the subject. The priests and the wise men. Despite a recent study has come out on this very thing by Ruhlmann on Ehrman and his view of the religion. He says, the inscriptions and representations in the temples contain almost nothing but dirges, which, he's quoting Ehrman, related to the cult practices, the sacrifices and processions, boring, depressing, sultry, miserable hymns to the gods, or announcing that such and such a king had built a shrine. Most of the papyri are defiled by religious content, he says. Because of their religious or magical contents, they have little to teach us. See how ready he was to accept this culture. Such stuff can be dismissed out of hand, he says. To Ehrman, what he is looking for are texts referring to daily family life. This is the solid stuff, right out of the field trip, John Dewey and so forth. Namely, what he's looking for, he says, are business letters, memoranda, inventories, notebooks, court records. That's the stuff of reach life. We see das Volk, wie es wirklich war. We see the people as they really were in their daily, what we'd call their daily records, the dull stuff, repetition. Now, there's a basic contradiction in Ehrman's career that is an occupational hazard with all Egyptologists, it appears. The subject calls for vigorous, relentless scientific objectivity that shuns romance and fantasy. Above all, the two things always to avoid is romantique and fantasy. He says, must never be touched. Avoid them like the plague. Yet that's the very thing that led everybody into Egyptology. That's the only reason they get into it, you see. It's singularly lacking in practical application. Ehrman tells us that all his friends and family laughed at him for going into anything such a useless field. Has no career value. He says he was so overwhelmed by its romanticism, he formed a Sen club with the boys at school, and they went out and pretended to be digging and all this sort of stuff. And all. He was hooked on it by a boy, and it's the only reason he became an Egyptologist, because it was such a romantic appeal to him. He says, get rid of all that trash. That has nothing to do with it. This is the sort of thing you run into. Well, the breath of life of every religion, he says, is the mysterious, the intangible. It is not understanding, but feeling alone that counts. Unclarity and contradiction are the nature of all religions. He recoils at the thought of exercising faith, he says. Only absolute knowledge will do, he says. At the time in the 1920s, when the foundations of quantum science, the birth of quantum science was coming out, and Einstein and Berlin, very exciting things were coming out. But he says about that, the suggestion that such and such a thing might be possible instead of an absolute and proven absolute fact, says actually makes him physically ill. He says with its sense of uncertainties and possibilities was for him unacceptable, unscientific. Yet he can maintain without the aid of fantasy no man will ever have been able to understand, to gain the historical image. So here's a contradictory people. Well, Ehrman's foremost student, because this takes us right down into the line that we're criticizing. This, of course, we think now his students were Breasted, was one of his students, Gardner was another, and there Breasted is the grand old man of American Egyptology. And they had no illusions as to the maddening elusiveness of Egyptian words and symbols. But back in Chicago, we're quoting from Albright now, Breasted chafed against the exclusion of his field from the charmed circle of the sciences, to which he finally gained admission in 1919 by his hall lectures, which showed that man's destiny is to improve steadily and irresistibly without any help from on high. He tried to, in that lecture, he demonstrated from the coffin text was a proof of organic evolution, if you can go for that. There was nothing theistic about this meliorism, Albright observes. Breasted put it bluntly, man has raised himself by his own bootstraps. He used the case of Egypt to support his philosophical naturalism and meliorism, which he called the new humanities. Of course, there's John Dewey and all that school in it. For Breasted's successor at Chicago, Professor John Wilson was his student, and there was Wilson's student. So it goes. I don't admit that I was their student because I didn't learn anything, just myself. For Breasted's successor of Chicago, Professor John Wilson, authority is everything. His science may be practiced, he says, only by a professional archaeologist who carries a union card endorsed by a majority of his peers. We archaeologists are a small, jealously guarded group with a tendency to inbreed. The layman is given no choice, he says. We must have confidence that the historian, we're quoting Brother Wilson now, we must have confidence that and incidentally, when he says this is true. You have confidence in him. He wouldn't allow you to ask questions. To ask a question in class was very offensive. And to try to bring something up after class, he wouldn't listen. I tried to show him some very interesting parallels to certain things. We don't talk about that. He gives you the answer, and that's that. He makes it clear to the class you don't ask questions. Now, that's some science. But no, this is the way he puts it. We're quoting him here. We must have confidence that the historians have done their honest, painstaking best in collecting the data reverently, sorting them conscientiously. We must feel that the historians are learned and sound in method and attitude. We need only the assurance, only that the historian has tried to encompass all the details possible. Of course, that's the political argument, the political panacea. The committee has done a fine job. It doesn't mean a thing. That doesn't answer any questions, of course. We'll break an arm trying to do this. That's the answer that's always given, the political answer, which is not an answer. He did not encourage students, including this one, to ask questions. 40 years after Wilson's declaration of competence, George Posner, who's retiring, is now looking back, and he shows us the scientific obsession that led to Egyptology, what he describes as a discipline, and we're quoting him, that shuts itself in, suspicious of the methods of related disciplines, highly skeptical of any possible rapprochement. Its specialist work is a sealed vessel with materials which they like to think of as unique. This isolationist tradition, he says, goes back to the father of Egyptology, Ehrman. They go back, who dug a ditch, a fossa, he says. Deliberately dug a ditch between Egyptology and the other fields, which research tends to widen rather than to bridge. It gets even more than we have Brother Gay with us now who can testify to that somewhere. This is the way it happens. They don't encourage you broadening by going to related fields and so forth, even if they're closely related. That won't do. As it says here, it was Ehrman, that rascal, who dug a ditch, a fossa, between Egyptology and the other fields, which has been widening rather than narrowing. This state of mind, says Posner, has been calculated to cool interest and enthusiasm and cause people in other disciplines to avoid Egyptology. Now, what a way to promote your field. Keep as many people out as you can. Keep it for yourself. This jealously guarding. It's always been that way. And that's what Joseph Smith is up against here. Do you think they're going to give him an audience at all, these people? Wilson faithfully follows Breasted's evolutionary formula for Egypt. He writes a thing like this. Oh, time's up now. Gradually, without deliberate invention on his part, get the picture here, without any stimulation from abroad, he was to grope his way upward toward a life of greater maturity, of greater physical comfort, and greater independent complexity. The process was unconscious and terribly slow. That's the formula you had to follow, the evolutionary formula. He wasn't aware of the fact of what he was doing, anything like that. Yes, in my day, that was the formula that you had to echo if you wanted to get a grade. He delights in the discovery of one Egyptian author who had detached and scholarly state of mind to recognize that phenomena were purely physical and not a product of divine or demoniacal forces. For Chicago, as Professor Albright supports, Orthodox theism was increasingly excluded from consideration by the theological liberals of the divinity school, who reacted more and more vigorously against the place attributed to the Bible. A lot of Brigham Young students went back at that time, well, from various places in Utah, and came back with degrees from the divinity school there. If you took the Bible seriously, you would not be taken seriously. That was it. You could not be taken seriously. The close geographical and cultural proximity to Egypt and Israel, rather than stimulating research, was a warning to Egyptian students to stay on their side of the fence. Now, Told of the scholar who suggested that the study of Egyptology and the Bible together might be cast useful light on both fields, Ehrman fairly gagged at the thought. He says, "Never before or since have I found such a strange phenomenon among educated people as to suggest that if you associated Hebrew and Egyptian studies right next door to each other, you might learn something." Never heard of any such a fan. That shows how closely locked in these things were. It's a very important thing, because this is, I say, we have to get over this hurdle before you can take any steps here. For him, it was either healthy good sense of educated people or the unbridled fantasy of the romantic. He got absolutely nothing, he said, from the Bible. And the Quran, he says, "War mir immer ein Gräuel," abomination to me, for which reason he never learned Arabic. Well, here he's going to spend his life excavating in Egypt and never learned Arabic because he didn't like the Quran. When Ehrman shared the important discovery that a passage from the wisdom literature of Solomon could pass for a direct translation from the Egyptian wisdom literature, the passages in Proverbs and they're the same one. That had been discovered already by Budge in 1923, but it embarrassed him. He didn't mention it. And in an interesting study by Weil on that says all the scholars who discovered that you're not supposed to associate the Bible with Egypt, so they hushed it up. They hushed their own discoveries up on that. They should have been very proud of that, a very significant discovery, but it didn't fit into the pattern. So, as he says here, he was embarrassed rather than pleased. He did not want to find it out. He tells about Ehrman himself tells about the great Edward Meyer. Again, has been working on a subject, and he was just about ready to publish, and Ehrman discovered something that he found very useful, very very valuable thing. It was in his first volume on Egypt there, and he took it to Meyer and thought Edward Meyer would be very grateful for it. Meyer was furious. He says he didn't want it at all. It spoiled everything. He's got his paper all written. He didn't want to introduce that and have to make changes and so forth. Well, was this hunger for knowledge? Was this the objective, the cool, objective, honest search for wisdom? You see what these people are. This is not being very flattering, is it? That's why we have to stick to them. I say we have to quote them all along. When Ehrman shared the important discovery that a passage, well, we mentioned that already. Well, we got to get along here anyway. Yes, and this is Weil says when he makes a list of them, and he said when they discovered this very important relationship, none of them made any mention of it in their manuals, and such was their scientific impartiality and open-mindedness. Well, Weil himself calls for an end to all speculation about pyramids, which were built, he says, simply, soberly, and sanely. It was just an activity. Isn't it Mendelssohn who he was just an engineer, and he can tell you not only how the pyramids were built, but he can tell you why they were built, just as an exercise in engineering. So that was all. It was something to do. Yes, you pile up rocks like that, those huge blocks, 500 feet high, and get them all in perfect order. Just an exercise. And then he says that's all it was, in engineering. He had a cover article in either Science, I think it was Science. What did Science do? I think it was that, yes, or Nature. No, it was Science. Well, anyway, got to get along here. Now, this is important. Ehrman considered Eber's greatest contribution was to rid the world once for all of the erroneous idea that there was anything different about the Egyptians. They're just like, after all, a pyramid looks just like a gas station. There's no difference between them. No, it's the same state of mind, the same people. No, they emphasize that very greatly. That the Egyptians were, quoting here, a peculiar people, unchanged for thousands of years, a race of pious worshippers who were interested only in temples and tombs. Though I never call anyone saying that they were interested only in temples and tombs, at any rate. The Egyptians were allowed to differ in no way from the rest of us. Actually, they were perfectly ordinary people like any others. In the same spirit, Professor Wilson insists in a remark addressed to the Mormons, he says, the notion that the Egyptians were Kabbalistic esoterics devoted to hiding their mysteries from others dies hard. Though in the ancient world, such societies were all over the place, and there are plenty of people in aside from Mormon communities all over the world, there are esoterics who hide their mysteries. That would include the Masons too. But though the ancient world was full of it, in spite of his scoffing at the esoteric tradition, he writes that ancient Egypt was always at heart a sacred society, clinging passionately to hallowed tradition. Well, that makes it something special anyway. Also, according to Wilkinson, the belief that the early Egyptians had extraordinary intellectual powers is absurd. Actually, he had a number of simple skills which he vaguely pressed forward. That's how you build these things, with a number of simple skills and your just vague idea of what you're doing. Well, the triumph of science rings out in Ehrman's victory cry. Today, now that we have come to know the monuments of Egypt firsthand, and now that we can read the inscriptions and study its literature, every nimbus, every sacred romantic glow, every nimbus has vanished. In the place of the holy dawning which Goethe saw in Egypt, the full, unsparing light of history has broken in, and the ancient Egyptian has become to us a people no better and no worse than any other people. Whatever it was that gave Egypt its inescapable appeal, even to Ehrman, since it lay beyond the testing of the laboratory, could only be the domain of crackpots and occultists. Nothing but superstition and pure and simple. You had nothing. Well, let's skip my time. This is a very recent study which mentioned the first fleeting impression gained by Westerners, viewing the European scholars especially, of Egyptian afterlife. He says here, riveted on the Western mind the vision of a witch's broth of magic and superstition, an eerie obsession with the voices from the crypt and so forth, the next world, which has stuck with us until the present day, he says. Maspero noted that a visit to the Egyptian section of the Louvre gives the ordinary visitor an impression of sadness and weariness, tristesse and ennui. From the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, at least, another scholar finds the subject takes on a gloomy, uncanny character, which remains its permanent mark of Egyptian literature. Well, that's true of any Egyptian, any museum, I think, with their lugubrious attempts to make the patently dead things seem alive. The equivalent of tearing down the old Salt Lake Theater and putting a bronze plaque in its place. That's not thrilling. It's not an adequate competence. The invasion of the religious thought of ancient Egypt by reality, according to others, produced a new intellectual disillusion. Well, anyway, I've got to skip here because, and it must have occurred to the more questioning ancients, particularly in Egypt, wrote Cyrus Gordon, that such notions as deification of kings were make-believe. Well, they knew that. We know that now. In spite of ourselves, this is Herman Case writing some years ago, the Egyptians were constantly giving themselves away. The real theme of their celebrated wisdom literature is disillusionment. Isn't that the theme of all? Read the first chapter of Proverbs, after all. The sun rises and the sun sets and so forth, and there's no new thing under the sun. Brunner Trout frankly states that the whole literature is just satire. He said no one would actually believe that stuff. For the experts, this is a recent statement, the decipherment of hieroglyphics was followed by disappointment. The Egyptian religious literature Budge found disappointing. He says, for in no portion of it does there exist a text which is not associated with magic, and no text contains a connected statement of purely religious beliefs, which we know the Egyptians certainly possessed on any vital point. No text supplies any direct information whatsoever. And finally, there is no Egyptian word for religion in our sense of the word. That's a revealing statement. Breasted is no more complimentary. He says the Egyptian did not possess terminology for the expression of abstract thought. Hence the scribal literalisms and resulting decay in the late period. For Ehrman, the whole literature seems to us sultry and confused, he says. Only an uncomplicated folk tale like the Westcar papyrus told in the village square gives you pleasure, he says. But it turns out since then that the Western has great religious significance, the papyrus, Westcar. He says the Egyptians never attained, Wiedemann says, the Egyptians never attained to any clear idea of the Osirian world. The same confusion and obscurity reigned over it as over the whole concept of the unseen world and of deity. In moving terms, Edward Meyer tells us how never on earth is attempted such energy and persistence to make the impossible possible in spite of everything. He's speaking of the life beyond. He says, with grim determination, bitterum ernst, the Egyptians clung to it, after everybody gave up the possibility. They thought there is a solution to the problem of whether there's an afterlife. For Gardner, though displaying the full use of that imaginative and untrammeled freedom of composition of great Egyptian art, the picturesque but hackneyed representations in the temple of the Seti I, a great tourist attraction, are of so slight importance, he says, that we are justified in ignoring them altogether. He wouldn't even pay attention. Now, this was Gardner saying we don't pay any attention to the things in Seti. It's justified because they're the same old hackneyed stuff. Inscriptions in the tomb of the same great king are for Rader, he says, disconnected, faulty, and incomprehensible. Well, how can he declare them faulty if he can't comprehend them? This is a frequent resort of Egyptian students. I said, Mercer uses it all the time. It's a prime example. He doesn't hesitate to scold the Egyptian author whenever he can't understand the passage. He says the author stupidly made this so obscure no one can read it, he says. Puzzling or obscure. No, 90% of the time he uses that argument, because 90% of the time he doesn't know what he's reading. We have his footnotes and his cribbings in his own library here, which we're glad to possess. And so it goes. Well, we don't take up your time. This is an important statement, though. One of the last by Henry Frankfurt. He frankly declares, he says, the decipherment of documents has disappointed centuries of expectations. It's revealed a remarkable lack of philosophical content, at least in a form we can assimilate. Instead, the text introduces us to an apparent jungle of religious matter so impenetrable to our understanding that Egyptologists have increasingly shunned the task of interpretation. Instead of taking it on more closely and trying harder at it, they've increasingly shunned it. They've avoided it more and more because of the religious element in it. Something, well, he says, even the wisdom writing deals only with entirely trivial teachings. Where is the inexhaustible Oriental imagination to which the schoolmen so readily appealed when they want to explain something otherwise? Another expert here writes, this is cool, and this is quite a recent one. He finds the material displays with frightening clarity the spiritual nullity and paucity of invention in which the same details always recur over and over again. The Egyptians had, he said, it was just spiritual poverty, spiritual nothing. They had nothing, you see. For years, the accepted explanation for the flagrant contradiction in Egyptian religion was explained by the breakdown in logical thinking. They don't think in our way. This is important, you see. Spelaers, who was a Catholic priest, wondered at the crippling mentality that could believe in such nonsense as a spiritual pre-existence of human beings and a literal heaven and hell, he says. He admits that the early Christians believed all those things, or guilty of just such thinking, he says, but he attributes it to an early stage of development in human mentality, which the church happily outgrew. We're quoting him, how do you reconcile the ideas of a pre-existent state with our logic, he asks. It suggests perhaps an appealing to the forces of which we are unaware, which consists in large part in what we designate by the general's term of magic. Where there were contradictions, according to Gardner, there was no hint that the Egyptians ever felt scruples on this score. In matters of religion, logic played no part, and the assimilation or duplication of deities doubtlessly added to a mystical charm to their mythology. They loved contradictions, he says. He finds that Herodotus' account of Egyptian religion is disappointing, being obsessed with the idea that the Hellenes derived from Egyptian not only many of their religious observances, but also the gods themselves. The thing was not to credit that. That's his time to quit. Now, the Greeks always credited the Egyptians with great intelligence, and they prated their own achievements. Thales, Plato, the rest of them, Solon, they all went to Egypt to study. The Germans would have nothing to do with that. Theodore Hopefner devoted his whole life to ferreting out the passages in the classics that refer to Egypt, vice versa. And he run it down, and he says, today I see an article by Kakosi inclusivism of hypercriticism and exaggerated skepticism, but he says, Egyptology has proven that the exact science of the Egyptian arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy was in a very bad way. And, what the Egyptians actually gave the Greeks, according to that diligent researcher in that field, was only a few sayings that impress one as laughable, simple-minded, or idiotic, like so many old wives' tales. That's all he could see that the Egyptians got from the Greeks, or the Greeks from the Egyptians, with all the great stories about them. The Greeks could have got nothing from the Egyptians, he says, in spite of their own insistence on deep obligation, quote, because such subtlety was beyond the grasp of the Egyptians, who saw in their divinity intensely real beings and had absolutely no capacity to conceive of spiritual powers as something apart from these deities. Well, that's very different today. A much-quoted famous classical remark, I think, is in H.R. Hall. It says, all the Egyptians gave us was elaborate hovels of painted mud. I've heard that quoted by classical professors many times. Professor Carey used to say that. Egypt, nothing but elaborate hovels of painted mud. Well, religion was only the most obvious flaw. I'm going to end quickly, don't worry. Obvious flaw in this flawed intelligence, according to the school. Yet without the religion, which was scrupulously avoided at Chicago, Egyptology becomes, in Gardner's words, intolerably arid. Or as Maspero put it, speaking of the wisdom literature, arid and desperately banal. The problem, writes one savant, is that the coordinating of a multiplicity of apparently mutually contradictory beliefs and presenting them in such a way, the modern mind, hampered by its implicit confidence in the necessity of logical sequences of cause and effect, will be able to find some basis for comprehension. I love this, the modern mind. Just read the political news today. Hampered by its implicit confidence in the necessity of logic, sequence of cause and effect. Oh, brother. The case asks whether different approaches, Frankfurt's idea of multiple approaches, are to be explained in terms of the famous additive thinking of the Egyptians. Such fundamental issues as whether the Egyptians were monotheists or not have never been settled. They started right at the beginning. Was it monotheistic or was it many gods? Well, today they're still arguing it, though they make it very clear. Such a fundamental, some argue that the ancients had entirely different attitude toward any kind of observed process, a myth-making mentality, this is Wilson we're quoting here, which lacked the sense of time, relativity, and impersonal causation. Only recently have students come to question that fashionable idea of a mythopoeic, or for that matter, pre-logical, magical period or mood of thinking, which was all very different. That's been dropped now very largely, but it was once, a few years back, to explain everything. It was a different type of mind, mythopoeic and so forth. Today these remarks are taken as dated and prejudiced, and before all misleading, as indeed some of the more experienced Egyptologists are beginning to suspect in our own times. They certainly are. Even Breasted, in his later books, betrays, he says, a haunting sense of the mysterious unknown that beckons the explorer, of realms of being that lie unrealized in the unfathomed ages toward which our limited vision today looks. And Edward Meyer warns the modern visitor to Egypt. He has to be very careful against being enchanted by them as the ancient visitors were. He quotes here, only an expert from the University of Berlin escapes turning the gorgeous East into a land of utter fantasy. This is the effect the Egypt has on all of them, you see. After all is said and done, says Hermann Kies, there is always that geheimnisvoller nimbus, that secret nimbus, a mysterious glow surrounding Egyptian religion that Ehrman thought he got rid of. If the wise men of the Middle Kingdom could no longer grasp the learning of the Old Kingdom, what are our chances? We can hardly tell today, writes Anthus, whether what we take as typically Egyptian is conditioned by what, or when, or at what early period. Now let's see. But this is a long tradition, you see. Briefly here, the Greeks laughed at their absurd beliefs of the Egyptians, getting everything backwards and deifying animals as they did. What puzzled them was that obviously rational people, that's Athenaeus I'm quoting there, but obviously rational people should think that way, as Clement of Rome says, Clement of Alexandria, excuse me. Heliodorus even describes them as living in the gutter and in the stars at the same time, in the late period, of course. Though their ancient neighbors were amused and puzzled by the Egyptians, wiser teachers among them had to explain, as Plutarch does, that the Egyptian rites are not as irrational or as fantastic or as superstition as people think, but actually moral and profitable and consistent with both history and science. Iamblichus asked whether if the whole impressive structure of Egyptian priesthood could have been created by and preserved by nothing but shallow tricks, as he calls them, goiton technasmata, by shallow tricks. But there was really something behind it. He says, without these, there would be no priestly action at all. How does it happen, he says, that their teachings produce demonstrable physical results, that their works have lasted so long? And then Clement points to the Egyptian calendar, the high moral standards of their priests, and their advanced medical science. Where did the ancients get so fixed in their minds the idea that the Egyptians were the forerunners of Greek science? They're all convinced of it, Cornutus says. And if there were such blockheads, scientifically, as Neugebauer holds them to be, how, Santayana asks, did they ever get the pyramids built? I want to quote something now briefly from Neugebauer, because he is the most eminent scientist to take the Egyptians to task. He is the severest critic of Egyptian math and science and so forth. He devotes a separate book to the history of Egyptian mathematical astronomy. He says, and this is typical of the Egyptologists apologizing, excuse me, I'm going to, this is a stirrup cup. I'm leaving, see? Won't detain you long here. But Otto Neugebauer, he says he's only writing this book on mathematical astronomy, quote, to draw the reader's attention to its insignificance, which cannot be too strongly emphasized. I'm writing this book to draw your attention to the insignificance of the subject, which cannot be too strongly emphasized, in comparison with Babylonian and Greek contribution. Yet, according to the same authority, even Babylonian mathematics never transgressed the threshold of pre-scientific thought. In fact, he says, not a single text is known which can be called wholly observational record from the ancient world, a wholly observational record. In short, quoting him again, mathematical astronomy had no effect on the realities of life in ancient civilization. In particular, in the whole of Egyptian literature, there has not been found a single record of an astronomical observation, and no reference is ever made to an Egyptian eclipse in any writing anywhere. Now, this is significant. It's true, but it's significant. There must be some reason for this, you see. The extreme inaccuracy of all aspects of Egyptian astronomy makes it impossible to identify any of the constellations except for Sirius, Orion, and the Great Dipper. I'm going to show some pictures on that. I'm glad I didn't bring them. As to the discoveries attributed to Thales and Pythagoras, which they claimed they learned in Egypt, Neuge Power says they're totally unhistorical. At any rate, for them, there is nothing to learn from the Egyptians. Yet he insists, the same man insists, the Egyptians, quote, the Egyptians had the only intelligent calendar which ever existed in human history. Exactly what we need for astronomical calculations, without ever looking at the sky, without making accurate motion measures of the motions of the sky. Well, they're looking for something else. Obviously they did. How is this possible without taking a serious look at the sky? And the end product of whatever they were doing, Neugebauer says, for all its contempt for their methods, he hails as the high water mark of civilization. And quoting him, of all civilizations of antiquity, the Egyptian seems to have been the most pleasant. There is probably no other country in the ancient world where cultivated life could be maintained through so many centuries in peace and security, and that totally without the benefit of any exact science. Life without computers may not be so bad, you see. How does Neugebauer, and the question often asked of this one, how does Neugebauer reconcile such mental delinquency with such brilliant success? In the usual way, as a mysterious defect in the Egyptian psyche, displayed in, quotes, he says, the crass indifference to proof in all their geometrical examples. Now, this is some significant hints he drops here. If they had the slightest desire for insight into the general laws of nature, they would have detected the mathematical mindlessness of what they were doing. The idea that Egyptian thinking was scientific is wholly untenable. And again, he says, the question we should ask ourselves about the Egyptian is, does the attributing of our intellectual categories to these early cultures make any sense at all? We have failed completely to consider the possibility of a fundamentally different mentality, structure in these cultures. Different geistigen culture, he says, in these cultures, recognizing only more or less devious developments of that finding which culminated in our own culture. He protests the Egyptians' logic is really no different from our own logic, but that he never uses it, preferring to go beyond logic. In spite, he says, of their brilliant powers of observation, the Egyptians were infinitely removed from the state of mind which we call scientific, and never thought of looking for causal sequence based on exclusively on pure observation. After Professor Neugebauer's feeling expression, we can only say with Gillian, there is nothing left to conclude but the absolute non-existence of any scientific spirit whatever in the land of the pharaohs. So to conclude then, let's see now. There's something seriously out of line here. Neugebauer's model civilization built by a gaggle of loonies. His charge against the Egyptians contained their own rebuttal. For example, one, the Egyptian state of mind, which we call scientific. Well, it wasn't their science, but it got results. There's more than one mathematics, more than one science we're beginning to discover now. Well, some of the things you get in quantum science. And the second case, he says, if they had even the slightest desire to do it our way, obviously they didn't have the desire to do it our way. They got it done. Must they do it our way? Because we know there are more than one way of skinning a cat. This is a thing that Karl Popper is great on, as you know. This is a plain declaration that they did not have that desire. They desired something else, which they found satisfactory and apparently got results they were seeking. The hypocephalus is a wonderful example of that when you get to it. Could they have constructed the only intelligent calendar that ever existed in human history without serious and accurate study of the motion of the heavens? Again, could they have produced the most pleasant, cultivated, peaceful, secure, and stable civilization of antiquity, or of any time for that matter, promoted only by entirely trivial philosophy, intolerably arid literature, composed of unmitigated rubbish, and an absurd religion? Well, it's like General Grant's whiskey. If that's the effect it had, get me some of that whiskey. And these people take the Egyptians to task for their inconsistency. Well, we have confronted the negative before venturing here on the positive. The next time we go into something more positive. Thank you very much. Good supper.